In thinking about international affairs, it's useful to keep in mind several principles of considerable generality and import. The first is the maxim of Thucydides. The strong do as they wish, and the weak suffer as they must. It has an important corollary. Every powerful state relies on specialists in apologetics whose task is to show that what the strong do is noble and just, and if the weak suffer, it's their fault. In the contemporary West, these specialists are called intellectuals, and with some exceptions, they fulfill their assigned task with skill and self-righteousness. However outlandish the claims, it's a practice that traces back to the origins of recorded history. A second leading theme was expressed by Adam Smith. He was referring to England, the greatest power of his day, but his observations generalize. Smith observed that the principal architects of policy in England are the merchants and manufacturers, and they make sure that their own interests are well served by policy, no matter how grievous the effect on others, including the people of England, but most severely those who suffer under what he called the savage injustice of the Europeans elsewhere. Smith figures who departed from the normal practice of depicting England as an angelic power, unique in world history, which was selflessly dedicating itself to the welfare of the barbarians. One telling illustration is John Stuart Mill, one of the most decent and intelligent of Western intellectuals. In a classic essay, he explained in these words why England had to complete its conquest of India for the purest humanitarian ends. He was writing right at the time of England's worst atrocities in India, when the true ends of the further conquest were to enable England to gain a monopoly of opium and to establish the most extraordinary narco-trafficking enterprise in world history, in order to force China, with gunboats and poison, to accept British manufactures, which China didn't want. Mill's oration is the cultural norm. Smith's maxim is the historical norm. Today, the principal architects of policy are not merchants and manufacturers, but rather financial institutions and multinational corporations. A sophisticated current version of Smith's maxim is the so-called investment theory of politics, developed by political economist Thomas Ferguson, which regards elections as occasions when groups of investors join together to control the state by essentially buying the elections. And it turns out to be a very good predictor of policy over a long period, as he shows. For 2008, then, we should have anticipated that the interests of the financial institutions would have priority for the Obama administration. They were his major funders, and they much preferred him to McCain. And so we find. The main business weekly, Businessweek, now exults that the insurance industries have won the struggle over health care, and that the financial institutions that created the current crisis are emerging unscathed and even strengthened after an enormous public bailout, setting the stage for the next crisis, as the editors point out. And as they go on to discuss, other corporations have learned valuable lessons from these triumphs and are now organizing major campaigns to undermine any effort to enact even mild measures on energy and conservation. They do this in full knowledge that success will deny their grandchildren any hope for a decent survival. It's not, of course, that they are bad or ignorant people. Rather, these decisions are institutional imperatives. Those who choose not to follow the rules are excluded, sometimes in quite remarkable ways. Elections in the United States are extravaganzas that are largely run by the huge public relations industry, which developed a century ago in the freest countries in the world, England and the United States, where popular struggles had gained enough freedom so that the public could not easily be controlled by force. The architects of policy therefore recognized that it would be necessary to control attitudes and opinions. Control of elections is one element of the task. The United States is not what's called a guided democracy like Iran, where candidates have to be approved by the ruling clerics. In free societies like the United States, it's concentrations of private capital that approve candidates, and among those who pass through the filter, outcomes are almost always determined by campaign spending. Political managers are well aware that on issues the public often disagrees sharply with the architects of policy. Accordingly, electoral campaigns avoid issues in favor of slogans, oratorical flourishes, personalities, and gossip. Every year, the advertising industry gives an award for the best marketing campaign of the year. In 2008, it was won by Obama, who beat out Apple computers. Executives were euphoric. They exulted openly that this was their greatest success since they began marketing candidates as they do toothpaste and lifestyle drugs. It's a technique that took off during the neoliberal period, beginning with Ronald Reagan. In an economics course, one learns that markets are based on informed consumers making rational choices. But anyone who has looked at a television ad knows that business devotes huge resources to creating uninformed consumers who make irrational choices. And the same devices that are used to undermine markets are adapted to undermining democracy, creating an uninformed electorate that will make irrational choices among a narrow set of options that are compatible with the interests of the two political parties, which are best regarded as competing factions of the single business party. And in both the business and political worlds, the architects of policy have regularly been hostile to markets and democracy, except for temporary advantage. Of course, the rhetoric is different, but the facts are quite clear. Adam Smith's maxim has some exceptions, which are instructive. One important contemporary illustration is Washington's policies towards Cuba, ever since it gained independence 50 years ago. The United States is an unusually free society, so we have good access to internal records that reveal the thinking and the plans of the architects of policy. Within months after independence, the Eisenhower administration formulated secret plans to overthrow the regime, and it initiated programs of terror and economic warfare. which were sharply escalated by Kennedy and continue in various forms until the present day. From the outset, the explicit attempt was to punish the people of Cuba sufficiently so that they would overthrow the criminal regime. And its crime was identified. Its crime was successful defiance of U.S. policies going back to the 1820s, when the Monroe Doctrine declared the U.S. intent to dominate the Western Hemisphere, tolerating no interference from abroad or within. Now, while the bipartisan policies towards Cuba accord with the maxim of Thucydides, they conflict with Adam Smith's principle, and hence they give special insight into policy formation. For decades, the American population has favored normalization of relations with Cuba. Ignoring the will of the population is normal, but more interesting in this case is that powerful sectors of the business world also favor normalization. Agribusiness, energy and pharmaceutical corporations, and others who commonly set the basic framework of policy. Their interests in this case are overridden by a principle of international affairs that does not receive proper recognition in the scholarly literature on international relations, a principle that we might call the mafia principle. The godfather does not tolerate successful defiance, even from a small storekeeper who fails to pay protection money. It's too dangerous. It must therefore be stamped out, and brutally, so that others understand that disobedience is not an option. Successful defiance of the master could be a virus that will spread contagion, I'm borrowing Henry Kissinger's term when he was preparing the overthrow of the Allende government. And that's been a leading doctrine of foreign policy for the United States during the period of its global dominance, and of course has many predecessors. U.S. policy towards Iran since 1979 is another current illustration, which I don't have time to talk about here. Well, it took time to realize the objectives of the Monroe Doctrine, and they still face many impediments, but the goal is enduring and unchallenged. It took on even greater significance as the United States became the dominant global power after World War II, displacing its British rival. The reasoning has been lucidly explained. For example, when Washington was preparing to overthrow the Allende government, the National Security Council observed that if the United States could not control Latin America, it could not expect to achieve a successful order elsewhere in the world, that is, to impose its rule effectively over the world. Washington's credibility would be undermined, as Kissinger put it. That is, others too might turn to successful defiance if the Chilean virus was not destroyed before it could spread. Therefore, parliamentary democracy in Chile had to go, as happened on the first 9/11 in 1973, which is gone from history in the West, although in terms of consequences for Chile, and in fact for the world, it far outweighs the terrible crimes of September 11th, 2001. While these three principles, the maxims of Thucydides and Smith and the mafia principle, do not account for every foreign policy decision, they do cover quite a wide range, as does the corollary about the role of intellectuals. They're not the end of wisdom, but they're a good beginning. Well, with just that much background, let's turn to the unipolar moment, as it's called. That's been the topic of a great deal of scholarly and popular discussion since the collapse of the Soviet Union 20 years ago, which left the United States as the sole global superpower instead of merely the primary superpower as it had been before. And we learn a lot about the nature of the Cold War and about events unfolding since by looking at how Washington reacted to the disappearance of the global enemy, the monolithic and ruthless conspiracy to take over the world, as John F. Kennedy described it. A few weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the United States invaded Panama. The purpose was to kidnap a minor thug who was brought to Florida and sentenced for crimes that he had committed, for the most part, while on the CIA payroll. He had switched from valued friend to hated enemy by attempting some successful defiance. He was dragging his feet on supporting Reagan's terrorist wars in Nicaragua. The invasion killed several thousand poor people in Panama, according to Panamanian sources, and it reinstated the rule of U.S.-linked bankers and narco-traffickers. It was hardly more than a footnote to history, but it did break the pattern in some respects. One was that a new pretext was needed. The global enemy was gone, and it was quickly supplied. It was the threat of Hispanic narco-trafficking seeking to destroy the United States. The drug war had actually been declared by Richard Nixon, but it took on a new and significant role during the unipolar moment. The need for a new pretext also guided the official reaction in Washington to the collapse of the superpower enemy. Within months, the first Bush administration outlined Washington's new course. In brief, everything will stay the same, but with new pretexts. So we still need a huge military system, but for a new reason, what they call the technological sophistication of third world powers. We have to maintain what's called the defense industrial base. That's a euphemism for state-supported high-tech industry. We must maintain intervention forces directed at Middle East energy-rich regions where the formal policy stated the significant threats to our interests could not be laid at the Kremlin's door, contrary to decades of deceit. All of this was passed by quietly, barely even reported, but for those who want to understand the world, it's quite instructive. As a pretext for intervention, the drug war was useful, but it's much too narrow. So a more sweeping pretext was needed. And intellectual elites quickly turned to the task and fulfilled their function. They declared what was called a normative revolution that granted the United States the right of humanitarian intervention as it chose, for the noblest of reasons, by definition. The traditional victims were unimpressed, to put it mildly. High-level conferences of the global South bitterly condemned what they called the so-called right of humanitarian intervention, recognizing it for what it was. A refinement was therefore necessary, so the concept of responsibility to protect was devised in its place. Those who pay attention to history will not be surprised to discover that the Western powers exercise their responsibility to protect in a highly selective manner in strict adherence to the three maxims. The facts are disturbingly obvious and require considerable agility on the part of the intellectual classes. It's another revealing story that I'll have to put aside. Another question that came to the fore as the unipolar moment dawned was the fate of NATO. The traditional justification for NATO was defense against Russian aggression. With the Soviet Union gone, the pretext evaporated. Now, naive souls who have faith in prevailing doctrine would have expected NATO to disappear as well. Quite the contrary. NATO was quickly expanded. The details are revealing, both about the Cold War and about what followed, and more generally about how state policy is formed and implemented. As the Soviet Union collapsed, Mikhail Gorbachev made an astonishing concession. He agreed to allow a unified Germany to join a hostile military alliance run by the global superpower, even though Germany alone had almost destroyed Russia twice in the century. There was, however, a quid pro quo. The Bush administration, this is Bush 1, promised Gorbachev that NATO would not extend to East Germany, certainly not farther east. They also assured Gorbachev, I'm quoting, that NATO would be transforming itself into a more political organization. Gorbachev also proposed a nuclear-free zone from the Arctic to the Black Sea. That would be a step towards a zone of peace to remove any threat to Europe, east or west. That proposal was dismissed without consideration. Clinton came into office shortly after, and Washington's commitments quickly vanished. There's no need to comment on the promise that NATO would become a more political organization. Clinton expanded NATO to the east, and Bush #2 went beyond. And Obama apparently intends to carry the expansion forward. On the eve of Obama's first trip to Russia, his special assistant for national security and Eurasian affairs informed the press, I'm quoting him, "We are not going to reassure or give or trade anything with the Russians regarding NATO expansion or missile defense." He was referring to U.S. missile defense programs in Eastern Europe and NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia, both steps that are understood by Western analysts to be serious threats to Russia, and surely likely to inflame international tensions. A few days ago, the Obama administration announced a readjustment of its anti-missile systems in Europe. That led to a great deal of commentary and debate in the media. And as in the past, the commentary skillfully evaded the central issue. The systems are advertised as defense against an Iranian threat, but that cannot be the case. The chance of Iran launching a missile attack is about at the level of an asteroid hitting the Earth. Iran would instantly be incinerated in response. The purpose of the U.S. interception systems is to prevent any retaliation to a U.S. or Israeli attack on Iran. Anti-missile systems are in fact a first strike weapon, and that is understood on all sides. But that's one of those facts that's best left in the shadows, so it's ignored. Well, returning to NATO, its declared jurisdiction by now is even more expansive than the Russian borders. Obama's national security advisor, Marine Commandant James Jones. He urges that NATO should move to the south as well as to the east so as to reinforce U.S. control over Middle East energy. General Jones also advocates what he calls a NATO response force, which will give the U.S.-run military alliance, quoting, much more flexible capability to do things rapidly at very long distances. That's a goal that the United States is working hard to achieve now in Afghanistan. The NATO Secretary General, Jaap Scheffer, informed the NATO conference that NATO troops have to guard pipelines that transport oil and gas that's directed for the West, and more generally, they have to produce sea routes used by tankers and other crucial infrastructure of the energy system. Now, that decision spells out more explicitly the post-Cold War policies of reshaping NATO into a U.S.-run global intervention force with special concern for control over energy. Presumably, the task includes protection of a projected $7.6 billion pipeline that would deliver natural gas from Turkmenistan to Pakistan and India, running through Afghanistan's Kandahar province, where Canadian troops are deployed. The goal, I'm quoting, is to block a competing pipeline that would bring gas to Pakistan and India from Iran and to diminish Russia's dominance of Central Asian exports, quoting the Canadian press, which realistically outlines some of the contours of the new great game in the region, to which the U.S.-run international intervention force, called NATO, is to be a major player. From the earliest post-World War days, it was understood that Western Europe might choose to follow an independent course, perhaps the Gaullist vision of a Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals. In this case, the problem is not a virus that might spread contagion, but a pandemic that might bring down the whole system of global control. And NATO was partially intended to counter that serious threat. Current NATO expansions and the ambitious goals of the new NATO carry these objectives further. Well, so matters have proceeded through the unipolar moment, adhering very well to the standard principles of international affairs. More specifically, the policies conform closely to doctrines of world order that were formulated by high-level U.S. planners during World War II. From 1939, they recognized that whatever the outcome of the war, the United States would become a global power, displacing Britain. And accordingly, they developed plans for the U.S. to exercise control over a substantial portion of the globe. This grand area, as they called it, would include the Western Hemisphere, of course, the former British Empire, the Far East, and Western Asia's energy supplies. And within this grand area, quoting the documents, the United States would hold unquestioned power with military and economic supremacy and would act to ensure the limitation of any exercise of sovereignty by states that might interfere with its global designs. It was all public for 60 years. At first, planners thought that Germany might prevail in Europe, but as Russia began to grind down the Wehrmacht, the vision became more expansive, and the grand area was to incorporate as much of Eurasia as possible, at least Western Europe, which is the economic heartland of Eurasia. And detailed and rational plans were developed for global organization, with each region assigned what was called its function. The South, in general, was assigned a service function to provide resources, cheap labor, markets, investment opportunities, more recent years, other services such as export of pollution and waste. At the time, the United States was not much interested in Africa, so it was to be handed over to Europe to exploit. That's the word that was used. It was handed over to Europe to exploit for its reconstruction from wartime destruction. One might imagine different relations between Europe and Africa in the light of history, but these were never considered. In contrast, Middle East oil was recognized to be, quote again, a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history, the most strategically important area in the world, in Eisenhower's words. Control of Middle East oil would provide the United States with substantial control of the world, quoting an influential planner. Now, those who regard historical continuities as significant might recall that Truman's planners were echoing the doctrines of Jacksonian Democrats a century earlier, at the time of the annexation of Texas and the conquest of half of Mexico. Their predecessors anticipated that the conquests would provide the United States with a virtual monopoly over cotton, which was the fuel of the early industrial revolution. That monopoly, once secured, places all other nations at our feet, President Tyler declared. And that way the United States might overcome the British deterrent, which was the great problem of the day, and it might gain unprecedented international influence. And similar conceptions guided Washington in its oil politics, and still do. Accordingly, Eisenhower's National Security Council explained that the United States must support harsh and brutal regimes and block democracy and development in the Middle East, even though this elicits a campaign of hatred against us, as President Eisenhower observed. That's 50 years before George W. Bush plaintively asked, "Why do they hate us?" Deciding that it must be because they hate our freedom. With regard to Latin America, post-World War II planners concluded that the primary threat to U.S. interests is posed by, quoting, radical and nationalistic regimes that appeal to the masses of the population and seek to satisfy the popular demand for immediate improvement in the low living standards of the masses and development for domestic needs. And these tendencies conflict with the demand for a political and economic climate conducive to private investment with adequate repatriation of profits and what was called protection of our raw materials. A large part of subsequent history flows directly from these assumptions, never challenged. In the special case of Mexico, a Latin American strategy development workshop at the Pentagon in 1990 found that U.S.-Mexico relations were extraordinarily positive, untroubled by stolen elections, state violence, torture, scandalous treatment of workers and peasants, and other minor details. But participants in the workshop see one cloud on the horizon, the threat of what they called a democracy opening in Mexico, which they feared might bring into office a government more interested in challenging the United States on economic and nationalist grounds. A cure was recommended, namely a U.S.-Mexican treaty that would lock Mexico in to the neoliberal reforms of the 1980s and would tie the hands of the current and future governments of Mexico with regard to economic policy. In brief, NAFTA, duly imposed by executive power in opposition to the public will. As NAFTA went into effect in 1994, President Clinton also instituted Operation Gatekeeper, which militarized the Mexican border. As he explained, we will not surrender our borders to those who wish to exploit our history of compassion and justice. He had nothing to say about the compassion and justice that inspired the establishment of those borders, and he didn't explain how the high priest of neoliberal globalization was going to deal with the observation of Adam Smith that free circulation of labor is a foundation stone of free trade. The timing of Operation Gatekeeper was surely not accidental. It was anticipated by rational analysts that opening Mexico to a flood of highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness exports would sooner or later undermine Mexican farming, and that Mexican businesses would not be able to compete with huge state-supported corporations that must be allowed to operate freely in Mexico under the treaty. And one likely consequence would be flight to the United States, joined by those fleeing the countries of Central America, which had been ravaged by Reaganite terror. So militarization of the border was a very natural remedy. Popular attitudes towards those fleeing their countries, who are called illegal aliens, are complex. The people fleeing to the United States perform valuable services. They're super cheap, easily exploitable labor, agribusiness, construction, and other industries rely substantially on them, and they contribute to the wealth of the communities where they reside. On the other hand, they awaken traditional anti-immigrant sentiment, which is a striking and persistent feature of this immigrant society, which has a history of shameful treatment of immigrants. In the past few weeks, the Kennedy brothers have been lauded as American heroes. In the late 19th century, they would have had to walk past restaurants in Boston with signs saying, "No dogs are Irish." Now, Asian entrepreneurs are sparking innovation in the high-tech center. A century ago, racist Asian exclusion acts would have barred them from the country as threats to the purity of American society. But whatever the history and economic realities may be, immigrants have been and are perceived by the poor and by working people as a threat to their jobs, their livelihoods, and their lifestyles. And it's important to bear in mind that the people protesting angrily today have real grievances. They are victims of the financialization of the economy and the neoliberal globalization programs that are designed to transfer production abroad and to set working people in competition with each other worldwide, thus lowering wages and benefits while protecting educated professionals from market forces and, of course, enriching owners and managers. And the effects have been severe since the Reagan years, and they often manifest themselves in extremely ugly ways that are featured right now on the front pages. So right now, the two political parties in the United States are competing to see which can proclaim more fervently its dedication to the sadistic doctrine that undocumented immigrants must be denied health care. Their stand is consistent with the legal principle established by the Supreme Court that these creatures are not persons under the law, and hence are not entitled to the rights granted to persons. And at the very same moment, the Supreme Court is considering the question of whether corporations should be permitted to purchase elections openly instead of doing so in more indirect ways. Now, that's a complex constitutional matter because the courts have determined that unlike undocumented immigrants, corporations are real persons under the law and in fact have rights that go far beyond persons of flesh and blood, including rights granted by the mislabeled free trade agreements. These revealing coincidences elicit no comment, showing that the law is indeed a solemn and majestic affair. The spectrum of planning is narrow, but it does allow some variation. The second Bush administration went far to the extreme of aggressive militarism and arrogant contempt even for allies. And it was harshly condemned for these practices, even within the mainstream. Bush's second term was more moderate. Some of the more extreme figures were expelled. Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, and others. Cheney could not be expelled because he was the administration. Policy began to return more towards the norm. As Obama came into office, Condoleezza Rice predicted that he would follow the policies of Bush's second term. And that's pretty much what's been happening. Although there's a different rhetorical style, which seems to have charmed much of the world, perhaps out of relief that Bush is gone. One basic difference between Bush and Obama was expressed very well by a senior advisor of the Kennedy administration at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy's planners, tenant, the fashionable word is partner. Britain naturally prefers the fashionable word. Bush and his cohorts addressed the world as our lieutenants. So in announcing the invasion of Iraq, they informed the United Nations that it could follow U.S. orders or be irrelevant. And such brazen arrogance naturally arouses hostility. Obama adopts a different course. He politely greets the leaders and the people of the world as partners, and only in private continues to treat them as lieutenants. And foreign leaders much prefer this stance, and the public is sometimes mesmerized by it. But it's wise to attend to deeds, not rhetoric and pleasant demeanor. Deeds commonly tell a different story, in this case too. Now, the current world system does remain unipolar in one dimension, the arena of force. The United States spends about as much as the rest of the world combined on military force and is far more advanced in the technology of destruction. It's also, of course, alone in having hundreds of military bases all over the world and in occupying 2 countries in the crucial energy-producing regions. Here in these regions, it is also establishing huge mega embassies, each a city within a city. It's a clear indication of future intentions. In Baghdad, the costs of this mega embassy are expected to rise from $1.5 billion this year to $1.8 billion annually in the coming years. The costs for their counterparts in Pakistan and Afghanistan are unknown, as is the fate of the enormous military bases that the United States has established in Iraq. The global basing system is now being extended to Latin America. The United States has been expelled from its bases in South America, most recently from the Manta base in Ecuador, but it has recently arranged to use 7 new military bases in Colombia, and it presumably intends to maintain the Palmarola base in Honduras, which played a central role in Reagan's terrorist wars. The U.S. Fourth Fleet, which was disbanded in 1950, reactivated in 2008, shortly after Colombia's invasion of Ecuador. Its responsibility covers the Caribbean, Central and South America, and the surrounding waters. The Navy defines its various operations to include counter-illicit trafficking, theater, security cooperation, military-to-military interaction, bilateral and multinational training. The reactivation of the fleet understandably elicited protest and concern from the governments of Brazil, Venezuela, and others. South American concerns have been aroused by a document from April 2009 of the U.S. Air Mobility Command. It proposes that the Palenquero base in Colombia could become what's called a cooperative security location from which mobility operations could be executed. Goes on to say that nearly half the continent can be covered by military transport without refueling from this base. And that could form part of a global en route strategy which helps achieve the regional engagement strategy and assists with the mobility routing to Africa, which is part of the global system. Now, for the present, the Air Force says the strategy is to place the base at Palenquero, to use it only for mobility on the South American continent, but it goes on to explore options for extending the system to Africa with additional bases, all of which are to form part of the system of global surveillance, control, and intervention. These plans form part of a broader policy of militarization of Latin America. Training of Latin American officers has sharply increased in the past decade, well beyond Cold War levels. Police are being trained in light infantry tactics. Their mission is to combat youth gangs and radical populism. And that term is one that's understood all too well in Latin America. The pretext is the war on drugs, but it's hard to take that seriously, even if we accept the extraordinary assumption that the U.S. has the right to conduct that war in foreign lands. The reasons why it's hard to take seriously are well known, and they were spelled out again last February by the Latin American Commission on Drugs and Democracy, led by former Latin American presidents Cardoso, Zedillo, and Gaviria. Their report concluded that the drug war had been a complete failure, and they urged a drastic change of policy away from forceful measures at home and abroad and toward much less costly and more effective measures. Now, studies run by the U.S. government and others have shown that by far the most cost-effective way to control the use of drugs is prevention, treatment, and education. And they have also shown further that the least effective and most costly methods are what are called out-of-country operations, such as fumigation and interdiction. The fact that the least effective and most costly methods are constantly chosen, while much superior ones are rejected over decades, that's enough to tell us that the goals of the war on drugs are not the announced ones. To determine the actual goals, we can adopt a legal principle namely that predictable consequences provide evidence of intent, and the consequences are not obscure. The programs underlie counterinsurgency abroad and a form of limpieza social at home, dispatching huge numbers of superfluous people, mostly black males, to penitentiaries. That's a neoliberal phenomenon that's led to by far the highest incarceration rate in the world ever since the programs took off 30 years ago. Now, though the world is unipolar in the military dimension, that's not been true for some time in the economic dimension. By the early 1970s, the world was becoming economically tripolar, with comparable centers in North America, Europe, and Northeast Asia. And by now, the global economy has become even more diverse, particularly with the rapid growth of Asian economies that defied the rules of the neoliberal Washington consensus. Latin America, too, is finally beginning to free itself from this yoke. U.S. efforts to militarize Latin America are a response to these developments, particularly in South America, where for the first time since the European conquests, the countries are beginning to address fundamental problems that have plagued the continent. They're the beginnings of moves towards integration of countries that have mostly been oriented towards the West, not each other, and also efforts to diversify economic and other international relations. And still more significant are the problems of internal integration. There are, at last, some serious efforts to address the Latin American pathology of rule by narrow, wealthy sectors in the midst of a sea of misery, with the wealthy free from any responsibility except to enrich themselves. That's quite unlike East Asia. One measure is capital flight. In Latin America, it approximates the crushing debt. In East Asia, it's been tightly controlled. In South Korea, for example, during the period of its rapid growth, capital export could bring the death penalty. These developments in Latin America, which are sometimes led by impressive mass popular movements, are of great significance. And not surprisingly, they elicit bitter reactions among the traditional elites backed by the hemispheric superpower. The barriers are formidable, but if they can be overcome, the results may significantly change the course of Latin American history with no small impact beyond. Thanks.
Señoras y señores, a continuación damos paso a algunas preguntas por parte de los asistentes.
Bueno, buenas tardes. Primero que nada, muchas gracias por estar aquí. Y yo quisiera preguntarle, ¿cómo ven un mundo tan globalizado, con una economía cada vez de un modelo neoliberal que cada países adoptan, muchas veces no por ganas, sino por necesidad? ¿Cómo ven los países en vías de desarrollo la posibilidad de poder instaurar una política de mayor distribución de la riqueza que permita a los países salir adelante y no depender de modelos económicos como el estadounidense? Gracias.
there's a technological problem. One was that, and the other is that I'm getting the Spanish, not the translation, for some reason, and being technologically totally hopeless, I don't know how to change it. So if somebody can explain the question in English, I'll try to comment. Anybody want to volunteer as a translator?
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to make the question in English. I want to know if...
Profesor Noam Chomsky, en su obra Estados fracasados, el abuso de poder y la agresión a la democracia, señala una serie de características propias de Estados Unidos que nos sirven para afirmar que en esta nación el Estado ha fracasado o fallado. Bajo esta misma perspectiva, en el caso de México, ¿podemos igualmente hablar de un Estado fracasado? De ser así, ¿cuáles serían sus características particulares y, sobre todo, ¿se trataría de un Estado fallido importado estratégicamente desde Estados Unidos?
Well, I did write a book called Failed States, which was about the United States primarily, and I pointed out that the United States has many of the characteristics of states that we call failed states. So the state authorities choose not to protect the population from attack, from destruction, from terror, and so on. Not being willing to protect the population is one characteristic of failed states. The United States has democratic forms, older, maybe better than anyone else, but they don't function. So there's a huge gap between public opinion and policy. I mentioned a couple of examples, but extends over domestic and international policy very widely. Well, it's another characteristic of what we call failed states. They may have democratic forms, but like, say, in Russia, they had elections under the communists, but they didn't function democratically. So it's another characteristic. So should we call the United States a state that has failed? Well, it depends. You have to ask, failed for whom? I mean, it may have failed for the population, but it doesn't mean that it's failed for the small sector of the population that's becoming extremely wealthy and powerful. In fact, over the last 30 years, which is a striking case, take a look at the last post-war period, post-Second World War period. For the first several decades, from about 1950 to the 1970s, that was the period of the fastest growth in economic history, and it was egalitarian. The lowest portion of the population did about as well as the highest portion. It was also the period when some form of welfare state measures were introduced, not at the level of Europe, but some form. In fact, the quality of life improved. There are measures of that, and the indices that measure quality of life grew along with growth, economic growth. That went on till about 1975, roughly. At that point, the neoliberal principles were introduced, and it's gone the other way, just like in Latin America. So the indices of social health have declined steadily from the mid-1970s until the day. They're now back what they were 50 years ago. wages have stagnated, productivity has declined. By every macroeconomic and social measure, the society has gotten worse. On the other hand, there has been enormous wealth accumulated in a very small sector of the population. And of course, U.S. power, state power, has increased enormously. So is it a failed state or is it a successful state? Well, it depends what you think the goals of policy are. If the goals of policy are what Adam Smith described, it's a successful state. If you think the goals of policy are what rhetoric declares, it's a failed state. And I think the same translates to Mexico. For some sectors of the population, the state has not failed at all. For the narco-trafficking enterprises, for the multimillionaires, and so on. I mean, you know better than I do that in Mexico, since the rules were accepted, the rate of increase of poverty is roughly comparable to the rate of increase of billionaires. So is it failed or isn't it failed? Well, that's a value judgment, not a descriptive question. Of course, the population doesn't have to accept that, either in the United States or in Mexico. And one of the exciting things about Latin America is that for the first time there are very substantial efforts to to reject it and move in another direction. And the other directions are not particularly mysterious. I mean, you go back to the first decades after the Second World War, it's pretty well understood why economic growth was so rapid and so egalitarian. You take a look at East Asia, the East Asian miracles, pretty much the same. And in fact, if you look at economic history, it's pretty much the same. Throughout economic history, it's been remarkably clear that large-scale state intervention in the economy and maintaining sovereignty has been a prerequisite for economic growth. That was true of England, of the United States, of Germany, France, Japan, and so on. And imposed free market principles, what are now called neoliberal principles, are pretty much what created the Third World. They've been a disaster for populations as far back as you go. The lessons of economic history are pretty clear. The lessons of the past 50 years are pretty clear. The same holds for gaining more freedom and justice in the society. These things don't come as gifts from above. They're always the results of popular struggle. They're always resisted. It's always been the case in the past. It always will be. So...
Professor Chomsky, I was struck during your presentation by the phrase, the law as a solemn and majestic affair, that you use with such pregnant irony in your presentation. And I was thinking about the ways in which the White House has used the law as a solemn and majestic affair to justify maintaining Luis Posada Carriles free in Miami and the Cuban Five imprisoned in the United States for long prison sentences. And I wonder if you could comment on how we may be able to penetrate that shield, because the U.S. hides behind the fact that it is trying the Cuban Five in a fair judicial system when we know for a fact that they were tried in Miami, in a city brimming with hostility against Cuba, and that Luis Posada Carriles is being tried as a liar and not as a terrorist, so as to keep them free. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure you know about the case of the Cuban Five, or you should. It's a tragic case, but also a very revealing one. The Cuban Five, as you probably know, were infiltrated into terror organizations operating in the United States, organizing terrorist activities against Cuba. Now, all of these activities are gross violations of international law and, in fact, domestic law. And they were infiltrating them to find out what they're planning. And they provided the information to the FBI. The FBI went to Havana and was provided with information about terrorist actions being planned in Florida against Cuba. And the FBI and the government reacted, namely by arresting the people who provided the information, putting them in jail for long sentences, show trial. The fact is the trial was ridiculous, but even if it had been a fair trial, the whole idea is so idiotic that you can't talk about it. At the same time, the United States is harboring terrorists in Miami. Posada Carrilles, who you mentioned, is one. But an even more striking case is Orlando Bosch, his collaborator in blowing up the Cuban airliner 30 years ago, Cubana airliner. Bosch was the U.S. Justice Department and the FBI requested the White House to deport Bosch as a threat to U.S. security. They charged him with 30 terrorist acts in the United States. Instead, the White House gave him a complete amnesty, pardoned him. So he's happily in Miami, a terrorist that the Justice Department and the FBI want expelled. He's now joined by Posada Carrilles, who will maybe get a slap on the wrist, but nothing more. At the same time, people who are trying to expose terrorism are jailed. And you might remember that there is something called the Bush Doctrine, Bush number 2, namely countries that harbor terrorists are terrorist states and have to be treated that way, namely by being bombed and invaded. So Bush number 2 was saying that we have to bomb and invade the United States, which is harboring terrorists and imprisoning people who try to block terrorism. Yes, the law is a majestic affair. What can you do about it? Well, you can't do anything unless people know. And in the United States, almost nobody knows. I mean, I've been to many meetings where these issues are raised in places like Boston, which is, a very educated, privileged part of the country. Nobody's ever heard of it. It's news to everyone. There's almost nothing in the newspapers. All that's said in the newspapers is that these dangerous people are threatening U.S. security and have to save ourselves and put them in jail. We don't have in the U.S. the kind of enough active popular organizations that can get around the silence of the government, of course, but also the media, so that the population can become aroused enough to overcome this terrible injustice. And there's no secret about how to proceed. It just takes enough dedication and effort. But you're absolutely right, whoever asked the question. It's a complete travesty.